OpenAI bets on families as ChatGPT goes deeper into households. The old approach just got more expensive. The practical edge now comes from changing process, timing, and tooling together. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Not your laptop. Your house. For 3 years, ChatGPT has been a solo product. You buy it. You use it. One person, one subscription, one account. But last week, OpenAI announced it's building a family sharing model, and that changes everything about how AI adoption plays out in the next 24 months. Here's why this matters more than it sounds. First, the scale math. Right now, ChatGPT Plus costs $20 a month per person. If a family of 4 wants access, that's $80 a month. That's expensive enough that most households just split one account or use the free tier. OpenAI knows this. They're watching competitor products, Anthropic's Claude, Google's Gemini, all bundling family access into their tier structure. OpenAI is not leaving money on the table. They're not leaving adoption on the table either. A family plan changes the unit economics overnight. Instead of one person buying access, you get 5 or 6 people on a single subscription. Revenue per household goes up. But here's the trick, the perceived cost per person goes down. Your brain does the math, $40 for a family of 4 is $10 per head. That feels like a different product category than $20. Psychological pricing, yes. But it also means ChatGPT moves from individual productivity tool to household infrastructure. That's a shift in how it gets embedded. Second angle, kids. This is the part nobody's talking about yet. If your 10-year-old has access to ChatGPT at home, not in school, at home, they learn to write with an AI co-pilot. They learn to reason with an AI. By the time they're 16, asking ChatGPT for help is as natural as opening a browser. OpenAI is not just selling to adults working from home. They're building the next generation's relationship with AI reasoning. That's a 50-year bet, not a revenue play. Education adoption follows usage adoption. Usage adoption happens at home first, then schools copy it. Third, the regulatory angle. Right now, governments are asking questions about AI safety, kids exposure, parental controls. A family plan gives OpenAI an answer to all three. Parental controls become a selling feature. Safety frameworks become a product differentiator. OpenAI moves from "we're a tool" to "we're a responsible household product." That's a positioning move before governments mandate it. Smart timing. Now, the contrarian read. Family plans typically cannibalize individual subscriptions. If OpenAI is smart, they price it at $30 to $40 per household, high enough that it doesn't undercut individual plans but low enough that it beats 5 separate subscriptions. But if they price it wrong, they've just told millions of current subscribers, wait, you could have been sharing this the whole time. Churn becomes a real risk. The family plan has to feel like a net new product, not a discount on existing capacity. Also, family plans assume sticky usage across demographics. A teenager uses ChatGPT for homework. A parent uses it for work. A grandparent uses it for, what, exactly? Low-friction use cases for older adults are still being invented. If adoption is uneven, OpenAI's churn metrics get worse, not better. They're betting that once the infrastructure is in the home, use cases multiply. That's usually true. But it's not guaranteed. So here's what changes in the next 90 days. First, watch for the pricing. If it's under $35 a month, it's a serious household positioning play. Above $40, it's incremental revenue with modest adoption. Second, watch for feature bundling. Does the family plan include premium features, advanced voice, real-time collaboration, or just access to the base model? That tells you whether OpenAI sees this as a product innovation or just a billing feature. Third, watch for competitor response. Google, Anthropic, and Meta are all watching this. If OpenAI nails the family angle, you'll see Claude and Gemini copy it within 60 days. That's the real signal. Here's the thing nobody says out loud: this is OpenAI preparing for a world where AI becomes as normal as Wi-Fi. Not exciting. Not scary. Normal. The family plan is the first step toward making that true. And once it's true, once your 7-year-old is as comfortable asking ChatGPT a question as asking Google, the entire downstream market shifts. Education tools change. Hiring signals change. Workflows change. This isn't a feature announcement. It's a market positioning move. Pay attention to what OpenAI does here. Everyone else is watching. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.